Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Retail Council of Canada's third webinar in the Enabling Retail webinar series. My name is Patrick Rogerson, Manager of Member Programs with RCC. Just to start our conversation off for the webinar today, for those that have questions, please submit them through the Q&A feature on the bottom right-hand side of the WebEx panel feature. We will queue your questions throughout the webinar to be answered at the end after our presentations are complete today. For anyone that does have questions that need to be addressed after the webinar, please email them directly to my attention. We'll provide the email throughout the presentation today. For our presentation, I'd like to actually introduce two individuals from the Canadian Hearing Society, Joanne McCall, Employment Consultant with Employment Services, and Joanne Bentley, Program Director for Communication Devices and Accessibility Consulting. Ladies, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick and Marcy, for inviting us, and thank you for the membership.
After we complete our presentation, we will then enter into our question and answer period, and Joanne and Joanna will be around for that as well, too. So before we actually get into the presentation from the Canadian Hearing Society, ladies, one of the most important questions that was actually brought to our attention before we even started to craft this webinar was the whole idea behind misconceptions. And I know that doesn't get into what we actually presented for the marketing materials surrounding this webinar, but there's still a number of individuals out there that have questions for RCC, probably for the Canadian Hearing Society as well, too, with respect to what are the misconceptions that we still have when it comes to an individual, a person, whether it's a customer or a prospect or a current employee that has a hearing disability. And I'll even be the first to say this, because I've done this in the past, around the customer service standard time when that was rolled out, very often people would say a person with a hearing impairment. And I feel bad for this, but I've used it before, but I know that it's not the correct terminology. And even some of the misconceptions around what a person can do when it comes to employment. So maybe to start our presentation, educate us a little bit on that.
Okay, so I can talk to that, Patrick. This is Joanna, Employment Services. From my experience, some of the common misconceptions can be when I'm introducing an employer to a job applicant who happens to be deaf, and to no fault of anybody, an employer may refer to the person as being hearing impaired. To date, many surveys have been conducted, and many deaf people refer to themselves as deaf, or people who have hearing loss may self-identify using the term as I am hard of hearing. So the terms of reference currently used are deaf. So if someone's deaf and uses American Sign Language, when speaking about them to maybe another employer, you would say this person has a skill set and they happen to be deaf. Or when speaking to another employer about someone who has a hearing loss, you would say, you know, this person is qualified and he happens to be hard of hearing. And just in terms of describing, rather than describing the person as being hearing impaired, that term was used in the past and no longer is. Joanne, did you want to speak to that?
No, I think basically that you've covered that.
Okay, and I think also to add to it, we do have a link to a video which goes in depth about a large number of misconceptions people have around in regards to individuals who have a hearing loss. This video was developed as part of the Enabling Change. Canadian Hearing Society partnered with the Ontario Hotel Motel Restaurant Association, and that link will be made available to all the members to see this video, which is approximately 10 minutes. It's very comprehensive and in-depth to sort of address what are the myths out there and to correct those misunderstandings.
So that's a perfect way to start this, and I know we're going to get into a couple more of those, not really hypotheticals because I've prepared for this as part of the presentation. I'm going to give another on lifting devices and whether a person who is deaf can actually operate one of those too. We'll save that a little bit later for the employment side. But Joanna, I'll let you take over now as we start to proceed through the slide content.
All right, thank you again, Patrick. Okay, so part one is a business case, and I have worked with this employer, Crate and Barrel, and what had taken place is that Crate and Barrel actually had a posting for a stock clerk right in their front window of their store, and myself and the job applicant walked in and wanted to apply for the job. we work together, with the manager of that store, and we supplied the manager with information. The job applicant had the skill set, they had previous experience. The manager asked a lot of questions. For example, how does communication take place in the job interview at this work site? How about for job training? And Employment Services, we were able to answer those questions and, for example, put those communication strategies into place to help the job applicant and the employer successfully complete the job interview. So we supplied them with the American Sign Language interpreter. After the person was selected, simply because their qualifications match the job requirements, we were able, again, as Employment Services, to locate funding for the employer for supplying them with an American Sign Language interpreter for, roughly about a week, 2 weeks for on-the-job training, and that was free of charge. The end result is that particular person has been hired and they've been working for a number of years, and they continue to work for Crate & Barrel. So that's a really great business case as to the success Employment Services has had with retail stores, especially highlighting Crate & Barrel. Moving forward in the PowerPoint presentation to the next slide, I think I've already talked to the whole term of reference. I've given a link to Breaking the Sound Barriers, which is really a great manual to help employers understand about employing people who are deaf, deafened, or hard of hearing. And when you're speaking to a person or about a person who happens to have a hearing loss, using the correct terminology. As I said today, many people who have a hearing loss prefer to be referred to as people with hearing loss or someone who is deaf, deafened, or hard of hearing. Deafened is a specific term which I would just like to expand on really quickly. That may be someone who later in life has lost their hearing or through a medical event has lost their hearing. So that's the term deafened. And it's very specific to the individual who has had that life experience and maybe later on in life they've lost their hearing and they weren't born deaf, for example, and have learned American Sign Language as maybe their first language. So in terms of terminology and referring to an individual, best practices, what are the current practices, please refer to that link, page 8, from Breaking the Sound Barriers, Employing People Who Are Deaf, Deafened, or Hard of Hearing. Another concept that I just really want to leave with the membership, or a resource I want to provide to the membership, is that employment accessibility planning. The Canadian Hearing Society can be a resource for all your members. Our website is www.chs.ca. If you go through that to that website, you will see Employment Services, and we have services for 2 groups, employers as well as job applicants. We also work in partnership with Communication Devices Program, and Joanne Bentley, Director of the Communication Devices Program, will speak to that. But to further discuss what does Employment Services do and how can we be a resource to the membership, on the following slide, the service of job placement. We meet clients who are qualified and we pre-screen them. We review what are their skill sets. We craft, with that job applicant, we craft out a cover letter, a resume. We practice job interviews. There is a very comprehensive program that we provide, and we offer contacts to the employer. We actually reach out, contact the employer, and forward resumes and cover letters, and help the employer to feel confident that that person behind that resume is a qualified person who is dedicated, punctual, and reliable, and wants to work. Other resources that are available through the job placement program is we have American Sign Language interpreters for our deaf job applicants, either for the interview or for on-the-job training. It's free of charge. We have a number of government funders in Ontario who are trying to support businesses in our community to hire persons who are deaf, and this is the way the government has chosen to allocate some of those resources. We do make arrangements with employers for unpaid work job trials, And again, we do have some government funders that will, if the work site cannot for some reason or other, cannot have that job applicant covered under their Workplace Safety and Insurance Board, that's fine. We have a government funder from Ontario who will write out the paperwork and have that person covered on your work site under WSIB, but it will be through a government funder. So there's a lot of applications that I would help the employer fill out. It's the paperwork. It sounds like a lot, but it's simple. I will complete it and submit it to the government funder, and you as the employer get the end result of somebody doing a unpaid work experience who does have the WSIB coverage. So that's just a small segment of what we do for unpaid work job trials. Workplace communication strategies, we work with the employer and especially with the employee or job applicant as to talk about and to address, can there be communication in this workplace and still satisfy the employer's expectation of work productivity and quality of work. So we have an open discussion. We have a lot of solutions. We have a lot of communication strategies which are practical and low in cost as well. So that's one type of service that is available to employers.
So Joanna, just a few questions here while we look at job placement. If I'm a retailer, can I actually reach directly out to the Canadian Hearing Society and say, we are actually looking to have a broad spectrum when it comes to recruitment. We'd like to provide a job posting to CHS to provide to candidates that would be seeking an opportunity like that. Is that something that is an availability to retailers?
Definitely. That is something through email. Just email me directly. We have, if the retailer is located in Toronto, we have 3 other job developers who work in Toronto, and we would then pool our resources, look at our job applicants, pre-screen the applicants for that job posting, and get back to the employer with a short list. If that employer maybe has a location outside of the Toronto area, we have 15 other locations for employment services within Ontario and approximately 18 job developers out there who could do the same.
And then I think my second question is almost answered when it comes to arrangement for unpaid work. And obviously I'm always concerned about the employee if they're coming in, that they're making sure that they're covered when it comes to workers' compensation premiums. So if that was addressed, maybe you can give me an example or just tell me what it's almost like for an individual who's gone into that situation, whether it's a retailer or a different sector. What was their experience like going in? Because it's almost like an orientation for both groups at that time. The employee coming into a new work environment, but also an orientation for the employee and the employer to overcome that communication barrier, really.
Right. Okay. So there's some key pieces that we put into that scenario to make it a success. So the client would still go through what we would say an unpaid work trial interview to make sure that it's a good match. So the employer would meet the client and almost interview them for that type of work. Realizing that it will be unpaid. We do supply, if that person is deaf, we have the American Sign Language interpreter present for the interview, and if there is there's training involved, we would have the American Sign Language interpreter present for that type of training. I personally worked with an individual with Winners, and it was at Cloverdale Mall. She was hard of hearing, and she also had a brain injury, but went through medical rehabilitation, and she was looking to work as a stock clerk. So I participated as a job coach for her on-the-job training because we didn't need, the communication part was there. She had her hearing aids. She was able to understand what the staff and manager was talking to her about. I was there more for the processing of sequencing of what the person was doing, helping them with their memory. So job coaching is another component. So we're there as much as the employer wants us to be there and the job applicant, or in this case it was the volunteer at Winners who was basically putting stock back on the hangers and making sure they were put into the appropriate places. That person was successful, and her success was that she realized that that particular job didn't match her, and the employer, we had about a month of volunteer work. The work met the employer's quality and quantity of work that was to be done, but that person realized it wasn't a good match for them, and they moved on into their career.
No, and very often you're right. It could just be the situation of it's not a good fit for either one still. We're still looking at an employment situation with a person, because we always want to make sure that we're removing that barrier of it's not a person who's deaf necessarily that's applying to this position. We're putting those accommodations in place to make sure that they are the person applying to that job. And you even gave me a new dynamic to think about as well, too, considering a learning disability that may also be there. It's interesting that CHS can almost extrapolate off of what the primary role of the organization is and help prepare individuals for something that may be foreign territory for them. So I think that's an important resource for the retailers to be aware of. If it stems into other areas, there is an opportunity for cross-support from different organizations, or those resources may already be there within CHS.
Yes, 100%. We work with other agencies, and we do have multidisciplinary background in terms of our employment consultants. Thank you. Okay, so on second slide for services for employers, workplace accessibility. This is another component of service we have for employers, which is workplace accommodation assessment. An example of that is we were contacted to do an assessment for an administrative assistant for a faculty at a university in Toronto. So what we do is we actually go on site, we meet with the individual, and we try to understand how does communication take place in the workplace, how is information shared, and then we develop communication strategies. A report is produced up to about 20 pages trying to implement any strategies, communication, or technical devices that may facilitate this person's ability to further enhance their communication in the workplace. And I work in partnership with the Communication Devices program to provide the workplace accommodation assessment. So many employers have contacted us after they've received the report. They then have the recommendations, and then they work with the Communication Devices program to implement any technical devices that are necessary. So it's a very comprehensive process, and employers have given us feedback, and they felt it was something that allowed them to either hire somebody for the job that they had a question, could they accommodate this person on the job, or to further the person's ability to continue in their job if they had a question, if the person was perhaps maybe not as efficient in the job that they would wanted them to be. Another service we provide is called awareness training. When somebody is hired, perhaps who is deaf, maybe in an information technology department at a bank, and this awareness training, we actually go on site, we work with the employee and the staff and management and really help that staff and management and the employee to understand what it means to communicate in the workplace, what are appropriate communication techniques, and really working with the staff to help them to appreciate, when somebody is deaf and they're trying to work, what does that mean? I'm a hearing person, I don't really understand. We really get the staff to talk about what they might feel are their own barriers to working with that individual, and then we give them resources and talk about appropriate communication strategies. It's a really, it's a presentation, it involves a PowerPoint, but it ultimately ends up with the staff really, we're always asking questions, so it's more, how would you say, it's more interactive, the awareness training, and we find that the staff afterwards have, including the deaf person who has been hired, they say, you know what, that was a value. I really feel closer to that employee. I really feel now I can communicate effectively, and I'm not going to be, embarrassed by making a mistake when I'm working with my deaf colleague. So that is sort of a hidden gem that we have at the Canadian Hearing Society. It's called the awareness training for employees and management. And me and a colleague are going to be doing one for a large bank in Toronto this Friday. So we're looking forward to that.
Joanna, often I hear from many retailers, especially when you get more to an independent type retailer territory, about often trying to implement a program. It may be past the point of what's considered by each subjective organization. It gets past the point of undue hardship for them based on a certain cost. I just want to prepare retailers, if they're looking to go into these types of services to educate their own staff or potentially to receive services that help to integrate a person with any type of a disability out there, but let's focus on an individual that would be deaf at this point in time. What are some of the examples of costs that would be associated? Are we talking the hundreds or the thousands of dollars?
Right. Okay. So ballpark figure, we do have cost quotes, which we can send directly to any membership who wants to inquire about this service, so we can definitely email our cost quote. But roughly speaking, I think for the workplace assessment and the awareness training, you're looking at under $900, under $1,000.
Okay.
That's what you're looking for. Now, the workplace assessment is you get a written report of 20 pages. Within that 20 pages, it's very comprehensive. It's looking at all the workplaces the person works in. It's giving you recommendations. It's listing some technical devices, and then it's connecting you with the communication devices program. The communication devices program simply goes on site. They test out the technology, and they don't charge for that service where they test out the technology. That's free of charge. The employer and the employee, if they choose to use the technology, then they pay for the technology. So technology is a little bit different, but the two, awareness training and the assessment under $1,000 is the typical price point.
And if I can just add to that, so this is the other Joanne. The communication devices, when somebody comes out to the workplace and they set up the piece of technology, whether it's something to help communicate over the telephone or a safety device, those devices are put there on a trial period, and so that's free of charge. And there's a trial period of 30 days, and so that they can make sure that that piece of technology is meeting the needs of the person with hearing loss, and it's a success all around. And if it's not, we look at other options to try to fit the proper technology piece with the employee to make sure that it is a success.
Yeah, because ultimately the goal is to make sure that person has every opportunity to be a resource of value add for that organization. So it's finding the right mix in some cases for that specific situation. And I think any retailer out there wants to make sure that the investment that they're making into an employee, regardless of who they are, it's a long-lasting component. Just like, Joanna, what you mentioned for Crate and Barrel, and I've heard with many individuals that have had accommodations provided by accessibility stakeholders, it's funny, not in a bad way, but they end up being the most committed to the organization because the organization is so committed to them.
True. Our feedback from our clients who go to work for the employer is they want to work, and they are very loyal to that employer who gives them the first job. If we all think of ourselves, we all remember that first employer who gave us our first job, and we worked extra hard for all employers, but that one employer with that first job offer really is meaningful. So a lot of my applicants are saying, yeah, I really enjoy working for my employer. I'm dedicated, and they're always punctual and reliable. That's the other side of the flip of the coin, is that employers are saying, you know, that employee is here all the time. They don't have that many sick days. So we are getting feedback like that. That's just interesting information to know about.
No, I know that's not the crux of what we want to get across here, but it's an important point to underscore for many that are attending today, or to be passed along to others that they'll re-communicate this to.
True.
Okay. So sorry, I apologize for the interruption. It's just very salient points.
Thank you. Just the last component, the last slide, is to help the membership is how do you put this into practice? Well, here's an example. On September the 22nd, we have a free symposium. It's in the Toronto area. It's a free symposium and employment fair. So if you're an employer in the Toronto area and you would like to do some recruiting, we will provide you with a facility, a table, and we will provide you with job applicants. So you can sort of meet. The employment fair will be from 2:15 to 3 p.m. If you want to be an employer and meet job applicants, again, we'll supply you with the table to sit down and have an open discussion. We will supply you with the American Sign Language interpreters. If you would like to attend as a member, just to, again, further your education on this topic of employment accessibility, you can also attend for the presentation from other employers who are going to talk about their policies and procedures about making their workplaces accessible for deaf, oral deaf, deafened, and hard of hearing job applicants. So if you'd like to attend, there are two ways. Number one, in the advertisement in the flyer, it says register for free for the event. You can send the email to info@chs.ca, or if you prefer, you can send your email to myself at jmccall@chs.ca, and I will make sure that you're registered for September the 22nd. This is a way of just putting into practice what we're talking about and utilizing our services here in the Toronto Region Employment Services of Canadian Hearing Society. So at this point, I am going to turn to my colleague, Joanne Bentley, and she will now take the reins.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm going to interrupt very quickly.
So sorry.
Because I can't not talk for 5 minutes. I apologize. If I could, ladies, if you wouldn't mind, we'd love to include this actually in the thank you email that we put out after this webinar. Is that okay, so we can pass that to our members?
Yes, that's amazing.
Perfect. Sorry, Joanne, go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. So the next part of the presentation is all around the technology piece. And accommodation for our employees, but not only employees. Let's take it a step further, and let's, as we go through this piece, let's think about our customers coming into your establishment and the communication barriers that may or may not exist. And often when we're talking about technology, for today, the purpose of today, I'm going to put it into 3 different categories just to give people an example of some pretty simple fixes. Some are low cost, no cost, and others do have a cost associated, and employees often have their own technology. It just depends on the situation because all situations are very different. So I'll put it into 3 categories. One is communicating one-to-one and in smaller or larger meetings, and that could be a staff meeting, it could be training, it could be just simply a one-to-one communication process and what that looks like. Secondly is telephone communication from many people, not all, with hearing loss. Can be difficult. It depends on the surroundings and of where they are. And for somebody deaf, talking about different forms of communicating on the telephone. And also then the last piece section would be safety. And I know that for many that's often a concern, and there's solutions to that. So moving forward, we're going to start you off. We're going to kick you off with a video, and this is was developed with the Ontario Recreation Facilities Association, and it's all around providing great customer service and alternate forms of communicating with your customer. So this doesn't necessarily have to be a customer, but think about your employees as you go through this, and we'll talk soon about some of the other accommodation pieces.
And Joanne, we talked about this prior to actually starting the webinar today when you provided this to Retail Council of Canada, and we reviewed the YouTube video and the other resources. It was actually quite humbling as we listened to this for the first time. We actually thought we had a technology issue listening to it, not realizing that it was from the perspective of the individual who was deaf, and it actually was quite shocking to us to try to almost empathize and be that person on the other end. So for those that are listening in, that you'll see the video in a few seconds, there is no technology issue. Be aware of that. There are some very quiet portions of this presentation as you'll kind of walk through the life of Peter and see what his customer service interaction is like. So Joanne, I actually remember a time when I was working at Home Depot during university, and that was one of the ways that we communicated with contractors. We had one contractor who was deaf. At that point in time, we didn't have iPhones. That would have been a great luxury back then, or a communication device just to do that two-way. It was as simple as pen and paper, and honestly, the appreciation that you get from that individual just taking the time to hear exactly what they need, it speaks so much just to the relationship you form, and it creates a long-lasting relationship for that customer with the organization as well, too. And maybe that's just slowing down in life a little bit more, I'm not sure, but I know that that's an appreciated piece on the other end for the customer.
Absolutely, and you saw in Peter's story how he expressed that himself. It's really about good customer service and speaking directly to the individual, and people appreciate paper and pen. Or another way, if you have a computer nearby, and typing out as opposed to writing out, because that is a quicker form of communication. But it is about taking the time and speaking directly to the individual and not to the interpreter. If somebody was to come in with an interpreter, as you saw with Peter's son, it's not about communicating through somebody else, it's really communicating directly. And there may be a process of a facilitator in between, like an interpreter, but it's really important to remember that you are speaking directly to the individual, and in this case, somebody who's deaf. So that Peter's story is actually one of my favorites. I know that everybody will receive some of the other vignettes that we produced with the ORFA, that's the Recreation Facilities Association. There's another one in particular, and it really highlights communicating with somebody who's hard of hearing, and that's Diane's story. So those two I will point out for you. They are all amazing videos. As we turn over now to the communication device portion of today, there's another video that you will also be sent, and that's the one that we did with ORMA, Ontario Restaurant Hotel Motel Association, where it's called Tech Talk. And so this will really give you a visual what some of the technology pieces look like as I speak to them today, so you can always refer back to that. So as I go forward with the technology piece, when we talk about one-to-one or small group communication, you know, it always depends on the individual and their hearing loss. It's not only about accommodating with technology, it's also about making sure that the environment is the best environment possible for communicating. And by that I mean not a lot of background noise, open spaces. So if you were having a one-to-one staff or a meeting with staff, that would be held in an environment that's not out in the open where there is a lot of background noise, because hearing aids amplify, and background noise interferes with the communication process. So some of the products that are available, there's a wide range, as I said earlier, but FM systems are often used for training purposes or communicating one-on-one or larger staff meetings. And FM systems, basically, it's a two-piece system, and what it does is, because hearing aids amplify, and hearing aids are getting better and better every year. Technology is advancing, that's for sure. But the one thing that people with hearing loss find difficult is cutting out the background noise and getting straight to the message. So what FM systems will do is they will take that message, whether it's somebody presenting or a small staff meeting, and it will take the sound and directly send it to that individual's hearing aid. So that really helps with the communication process and being able to hear directly. Other examples of one-to-one communication, as you saw, the system that was used in Peter's story is a text-to-text communication system. And often we see that, it's called a UB Duo. We see that in places for customer service, like some banks have that set up. The ROM, and I'm sorry to be so Ontario-centric, but the Royal Ontario Museum also has that set up to facilitate more of their customer service communication, but it's also used for employee communication as well. So sitting down with an employee and instead of writing, typing is a much faster process. So that is also one of the technology pieces that we see. Telephone communication, one of the advances really in phone communication now is Bluetooth. So connecting the phone directly to a hearing aid and not a headset. So we all were used to Bluetooth headsets. Now we can stream that, the voice of the telephone directly to a hearing aid. For individuals who are deaf, I don't know if people have heard of a TTY, that's a telecommunication device for individuals with hearing loss to a degree that they don't communicate on the telephone. And it's a text-based communication system, so somebody would type and then the other person would read, and it's a form of communicating on the phone text. Now, there's a new video relay service that will be established throughout Canada, so deaf individuals will now communicate through an interpreter, and that will be a free service. But there's other modes of communicating. So often in workplaces, what happens is, as opposed to communicating on the telephone, communication is now through email, or services where you can take voicemail messages and you can convert them into text so that people can have equal access to information just through a different route. Video relay interpreting is coming as well, and we actually have video relay interpreting. And what that means, if you had an employee who used American Sign Language as their mode of communication, you could have a one-on-one meeting with that individual through an interpreter through video. So you don't actually have to have an interpreter on site. It's all done remotely through video. And that gives the person, that's their language. ASL is their language. So you're communicating with that individual in their language. And it's a very natural process. Safety is the last one that I will talk about, and many people have concerns all around safety. So there's a number of different technology visual notification systems that we use, and one is, it's all around fire safety. That's the primary concern of many. So now when we're talking about buildings, many buildings now have visual fire alarms built in, but if they don't, there are simple solutions. So we can tie the fire alarm right into an iPhone, let's say, as an example, or any other smartphone, and so that would vibrate as opposed to ring, so that would alert somebody who, with any degree of hearing loss, and they would be alerted to the fire or an emergency communication that would be announced, or simply, you know, we're having a staff meeting, can you come to the back, or I need to see you. So that's an alternate form of communicating with the employee, is something simple like a smartphone. We have had situations in like a retail situation where somebody is hard of hearing, and it's a larger environment, so they didn't know if somebody was coming through the door. They felt that they needed to know that. So often when you go into a retail outlet, sometimes you'll hear a bell when somebody walks through. What we've done is we've worked with notification systems, and there's two different ones, and one is where you actually have the magnets on the doors, and it's a very common solution. So when somebody walks through the door, what it does is it sends a visual signal to that individual to alert them so that they can attend to that customer's needs right away. Or there's vibrating pagers that you can tie into that. Or, you know, there's mats, a pressure mat, so when somebody steps on it. So there's there's all kinds of products out there. Every situation is unique. We are very skilled at taking that situation and providing a solution, and sometimes it's just a matter of thinking outside the box. One really common, and it's not necessarily a communication device, but it does communicate, are mirrors. We use mirrors all the time as our form of communication. It's a visual signal. It's for larger warehouses. Everybody looks towards the mirror, and that helps identify if somebody's coming down the path, and that provides safety for that person with hearing loss. So there's a ton of products out there. I do want to leave you with knowing that there are solutions, and some are mainstream universal design solutions, and they're not custom designed, and then other times you can have something that really is customized to meet your needs, and that's something that we can certainly help you with.
I think maybe the message to reinforce behind that, and this has come up within some of our past webinars too, Joanne, and for those that have heard this before, please bear with me, was a bona fide occupational health and safety requirements of the job for any type of disability for a moment, and then we'll go back to a person who is deaf to give a specific example. There are many times where during a recruitment process, some individuals who maybe still have not overcome barriers or misconceptions have the impression that there is not an ability to hire that person to perform a certain task without doing a job fit match. The one that I've heard from a forklift perspective, and I have the answer for already, which is the good part. There was a question once from a retailer inquiring whether or not a person who was deaf could actually operate a forklift. And the answer actually is yes, they can. There is a requirement visually for the operation of that legally, and also in reference from a CSA standard, but there is nothing that says a person cannot perform that task if they are partially deaf or completely deaf.
That's right. And we've come across that question many, many, many times. I don't know, Joanna, if you've worked with somebody in that situation where they did have the lights.
I could actually add to that. In terms of Employment Services Toronto Region, we have been contacted to do a work site assessment, a work site accessibility assessment to provide the employer and the employee with strategies. So I wasn't part of that project. It was another employment consultant who happened to be deaf who went on site and did the assessment. So that's a resource that the employer can tap into to get that answer and to tap into a list of what technical devices they could use.
Right, and we had a situation where we were working with a transportation company where the mechanic was underneath, it was a large bus, and they were really, really concerned about fire safety. And we went in there, and it was a portable, simple device that we use in a home environment that we set up for that person, and so that if there was an emergency, that they would be alerted through a small light that flashes.
Okay, moving on to the next section. And ladies, thank you for the answer, because I know for the retailers, they just want to be able to understand that there is a resource they can even reach out to when they're not sure of how to proceed in that area. So again, this is where I think CHS, as well as some of the other accessibility stakeholders, will really pay off.
Yeah, and I can speak to the other accessibility services at the Canadian Hearing Society. This is Joanna, Employment Consultant. In the Toronto region, if you go to our website, www.chs.ca, and you go to accessibility services, we have quite a range which an employer, if you yourself want to set up an American Sign Language interpreter for the job interview for that job applicant who's walked through your door and has an awesome resume, you can actually contact Ontario Interpretive Services at Canadian Hearing Society yourself and schedule that job interview with the ASL interpreter. Another accessibility service that we have is captioning service. If you have a deaf employee and you're going to be having a large meeting, maybe 30 people, and you're going to be reviewing a new policy that's going to be implemented into your workplace, the employer yourself can contact captioning services through Canadian Hearing Society and then get captioning on site during that meeting for your deaf employee. So there's a lot of services there. In the PowerPoint presentation, you have the website links. Feel free just to continue researching that website, which is www.chs.ca. And Joanne, from Communication Devices, did you have something?
I just wanted to say, as we wrap up, that the Canadian Hearing Society, we provide solutions. So, you know, and it's all around accessibility and improving your employee, your customer reach, whatever the solution is, like putting videos, as an example, putting videos up on your website, making sure that they're accessible, making sure that they're captioned, and we provide all of those services. So we provide solutions specifically for our community.
Perfect. And thankfully, ladies, you've done a great job. You've got Joanna's information here, Melanie, who was not able to join us today, I realize. And if at any point Joanna need to reach out to you, I'm sure they can go through either Melanie or Joanna to contact you.
Absolutely.
So quickly, just to move to our question and answer period, folks, just a reminder for those in attendance that the webinar is being recorded today for those to access. We will include a link to the recording in the thank you email that will be distributed following this webinar and in preparation for webinar number 4, where we're going to be featuring the CNIB as our stakeholder presenter. We ask, though, now that you would submit your questions. We will go on mute for a few seconds as those come in. But before we wrap that up, Joanna, thank you very much for coming today. We really appreciate it. We know you will be getting questions not only from us at some point in time, from our members, but potentially from them directly as well, too. And accommodating us today, I think, is one of the best things that can be done to remove some of those barriers and misconceptions that it's not possible for retailers to reach out to stakeholders. I know many of our members have already, but for those that haven't, this is a good introduction to what CHS can do for them. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Marcy, and thank you, membership, for inviting me.
So, folks, we'll just go on pause for one moment as questions come in, and then Joanne and Joanna will address those. But for those who will be parting, thank you very much for today, and we look forward to the questions that are coming in a few seconds.
All right, so we have a few questions. So question number 1 is, are there tip sheets, resources available for staff education that can be used as part of their customer service training for new hires and also part of our internal AODA training? Okay, so this is Joanna, employment consultant. There's a number of tip sheets. Number 1, if my job applicant is starting work at your workplace, I can actually write a tip sheet out for you free of charge. But looking for something general, something you can read about now, on slide 17, I have 2 guides/manuals. One is called Accessibility Guide to Businesses and Service Providers, and the other one is called breaking the sound barriers, employing people who are deaf and hard of hearing. These are manuals. They're about 40 pages each. They're very comprehensive, and there's a lot of information there that you can access from a customer service point of view as well as from an employment point of view. So the links are there on slide 17. Joanne, did you have something to add?
No, not as far as, there's all kinds of information on our website, but I think that the two resources that you mentioned, Joanna, are appropriate.
Okay.
Okay, so next question, there's actually a couple of these ones that have come through, so I'm going to pile it all up into one that sort of asks the same thing. So a lot of questions with regards to the video that was played. So basically, where can it be found? And also, is there additional videos that they can use for training their staff?
Absolutely, and I'll answer that one. It's Joanne. We have been fortunate enough to receive a grant through the Enabling Change, and we worked with, like I mentioned, the Ontario Restaurant, Hotel and Motel Association and the Recreation Facilities Association, and you will be receiving links to all of these videos. And they are fabulous, and as I said, it's not only from an employee perspective, but it's also how you provide excellent customer service to your customers walking through your door.
So they can use it in their own training program?
Absolutely.
Great. All right, so as part of customer service standard, how are other retailers training staff about the best practices to exceed the needs of customers with hearing disabilities?
I think that varies. As you know, in Ontario, we have AODA, and the ADO website is something that most companies are utilizing. It's a great overview. And then when you get specifics, like it's an overview, you can't be the expert in every single disability, and as you've done here today, you're inviting the experts from the different fields, and so we often see that as well.
And to add, this is Joanna, Employment Services. Our awareness training, sometimes we have employers contact us just to have that training, because the awareness training talks about 4 communication groups, people who are deafened, hard of hearing, and then hearing. And how do these groups get along? How do these people communicate? So that's one way you could actually have an awareness training for your staff, maybe at your annual conferences, or that's something you could do right at this time to become more aware of appropriate language, appropriate communication techniques. So that's just something that I could think off the top of my head people could do currently, the membership could do. It's called awareness training, and it's at Canadian Hearing Society. Thank you.
Great. Although sign language is the source of acceptable communication for a customer that is deaf, when it comes to retail shopping and the experiences, what challenges have you observed for customers who are hearing impaired, and what recommendations can you make to retailers to accommodate them?
It's Joanne here. I'll try to answer that. It's really, I don't want to necessarily say it's a communication barrier. It's about communicating with anybody. Somebody who is deaf uses a different language. You would communicate with somebody who perhaps English was not their first language. If you need to gesture, if perhaps writing down wouldn't work for somebody whose first language was not English, but it's really about communicating and engaging with that individual, and it's about an attitude, really. It's not necessarily that you need to know ASL. It's more about engaging with your customer, maintaining eye contact, having, welcoming smile, and gesturing and writing things down or using, if you have a smartphone, using that technology that's available, such as speech to text.
And Joanne, you bring up a good point. I don't think you said it, and I'll be a little more blatant. For a person who is deaf, they go through many barriers, and I think a lot of angst when trying to overcome that communication exists with a person who doesn't have one at that point in time. Customer service is one of the greatest components of the retail environment, and the struggle that a sales associate, a customer service rep, whatever their title is, the struggle that they may have to go through, the pain they may have to go through from getting over that barrier to be able to interact with the person who's deaf, whether it's using an iPhone, whether it's writing something down on paper, whether it's being patient. Again, that's worth it to go through that for the experience for the customer more than anything else. And I think that leads into a question I have on etiquette. I don't think there's a right answer to this, or one answer. What's the best way to interact with a person if you're looking at a medium to communicate with them on? Should I use something like a speech to text if I have the luxury of an iPhone available? Should I go straight for a pen and paper? What's prudent?
So I think that's going to depend on the individual for sure. Speech to text is a great form of accommodating that individual and yourself. It's quick. It's come a long way. At one time, it wasn't as accurate as it is now. It depends on your person and their communication mode. So, let's say that I was the deaf individual and I don't speak. The speech to text wouldn't work as well for me. Like, I would need to take your device and I'd have to type to you, and then it would speak to you if that would work. That may be a longer process. You need to think about the age, the demographics. If it's somebody who's older, a senior shopping, pen and paper. Pen and paper is great for people who are not as technically savvy.
Yeah. And even the technology may have barriers when it comes to the vernacular, the type of subject matter. It may not be able to communicate a certain word back depending on which retail environment are we in, what are we specifically talking about. Really the safest bet, I'll say, is pen to paper, really.
Yeah, it is. And gesturing.
Okay, so that's it for questions. We will keep the question and answer section open for a few more minutes after Patrick ends the webinar. So I will pass it now back to Patrick for closing.
Thank you, Marcy. So, folks, we'd like to thank you again. We know this takes a lot of time out of your days, especially as we start to get into the fall season with back to school and the Christmas season that'll be coming up as well, too. Folks, we really appreciate you taking the time because we know that you have a vested interest in your organization's success when it comes to not just meeting the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and for those outside of Ontario, looking at what best practices can be instituted in your organizations across Canada. So again, folks, we truly value that you've taken the time for attending this webinar. We look forward to seeing you in webinar number 4, which is scheduled for September 27th, where we'll be joined by CNIB for their presentation. And we look forward to your questions. Until then, have a great day.